NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Hello, my name is Michael Heiskell, President of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to NACDL's 22nd Annual State Criminal Justice Network Conference, where the theme is Sharing Strategies and Strengthening the Movement, 50 Years of Mass Incarceration in America. Where do we go from here? I am glad you have decided to participate in this year's free virtual conference, where we have brought together the nation's leading experts on criminal legal reform to discuss a number of important state reform issues. For 65 years now, NACDL has been committed to preserving fairness and promoting a rational and humane criminal legal system. A core aspect of NACDL's mission is to serve as a leader, alongside diverse coalitions such as yours, in identifying and reforming flaws and inequities in the criminal legal system and redressing systemic racism. That is the purpose of this annual conference. With the need to continue to make developments to advance racial justice, reimagine policing and public safety, enact fair sentencing policies, and encourage expanded decarceration of our jails and prisons, it remains pertinent to learn from each other, devise tactics on how to combat misinformation, as well as share strategies that have successfully created change and will continue to propel us forward. It is my hope that by the end of this conference that you will have gained valuable resources, insight, and strategies to bring back to your communities to help advance criminal legal reform. For those of you who this may be your first event within NACDL, or if we haven't had the opportunity to work with you in the past, please consider NACDL as a partner in your efforts. NACDL has been committed and continues to be committed to serving as a partner with our state affiliates, state advocacy groups, and organizations to promote criminal legal reform at the state level. If you are a criminal defense lawyer, you can become an NACDL member to strengthen our voice and influence and receive access to numerous valuable benefits. Visit nacdl.org for more information. I'll repeat it once again, nacdl.org for more information. Finally, I want to express my appreciation to the NACDL Foundation for Criminal Justice for support of NACDL and for making this program possible and free for attendees. For those of you who believe in reforming our criminal legal system, and I believe all of you are, please consider supporting the NACDL Foundation for Criminal Justice by visiting nacdl.org/foundation. Again, nacdl.org/foundation. Also consider joining the foundation on October the 19th in Washington, D.C. for the Redemption Gala, which will take place at the National Museum of the American Indian. You can learn more by visiting nfcj.org/redemption. Again, nfcj.org/redemption. Once again, I welcome and thank you for participating in this year's State Criminal Justice Network Conference. I will now turn it over to Monica Reed, the Senior Director of Advocacy for NACDL. Monica.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction. And I join him in welcoming everyone to our 22nd Annual State Criminal Justice Network Conference. First, I encourage you to continue to do what you're already doing, which is introduce yourself in the chat. You can place your name, your org, and where you're from. Toward this session, we will have ample time for audience Q&A, but we ask that you use the Q&A feature in Zoom at the bottom of the screen for questions that you would like the panel to address. If we don't get to all the questions, no worries. We will actually be sharing our esteemed panelists' contact information towards the end of this session. And also just very quickly, I do want to highlight, and we had sent out to all registered attendees, but really want to highlight our sort of code of conduct for NACDL. It's applicable to all of our programs, including virtual programs such as this. And essentially, we just endeavor to make sure that we have and foster an environment that's free from harassment, of any kind, discrimination or intimidation. So we just ask that people consider that code of conduct when engaging with our panelists, with engaging one another in the chat. And unfortunately, Unfortunately, if we deem that you had violated the code of conduct, we will have to remove you from today's session. And lastly, as we talk about reforms to our criminal legal system, I really want to lift up language as well and just ask everyone attending, again, as you sort of engage with the chat and the Q&A, to really refrain from using language that would dehumanize, such as felon, offender, inmate, ex-con, et cetera, and use language that restores dignity and humanity to those who are directly impacted by our criminal legal system. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel moderator for our opening panel. This one is setting the stage, really looking at the 50 years of mass incarceration. Where do we go from here? And allowing our panelists to really sort of kick off this two-day conference with that panel discussion. This panel's moderator is going to be Nicole Porter. She serves as the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. And Nicole, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you to NACDL for hosting this convening, this virtual convening, so many can be joining from across the country, and for featuring the important topic marking the 50th year of mass incarceration. So I'm going to give some opening remarks on that, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into it with the dialogue this afternoon. We're going to leave plenty of time for engagement with you all in the audience. So please do use the Q&A function, sharing your questions, sharing your comments, so that we as panelists can engage directly with you all. So 2023 does mark the 50th year since the US prison population began its unprecedented surge. The prison population peaked in 2009 and began a modest decline in 2010 of roughly 2% annually. But we are far from seeing an end to mass incarceration. And at the current rate, it will take 75 years to arrive at pre-mass incarceration levels. So with that context, we want to have a conversation this afternoon with our panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly. Their bios are in convening materials and on their organizational websites, and then I'll ask each of them an opening question, and they'll have some opportunity to reply with their opening remarks. One of our first panelists is Khalil Cumberbatch. Khalil is a nationally recognized formerly incarcerated advocate for criminal justice and deportation policy reform, and Khalil previously served as chief strategist at New Yorkers United for Justice. We'll also welcome Premal Daria, who is the executive director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at Harvard Law School. She has spent the last 20 years dedicated to challenging injustice in the criminal legal system. And also we are joined by Cynthia Roseberry at the National ACLU, where Cynthia works to reform the criminal legal system, focusing on issues like policing, bail reform, clemency, the death penalty, and other criminal justice related matters. So with the context for our panelists, the background on our panelists, I'll start with some opening questions posed to each panelist, then we'll get into a dialogue with you all in the audience. So again, as our panelists are giving their opening remarks, if any questions surface for you all, please do use the Q&A function. But Khalil, we'll start with you. Can you set the stage for this session, given your leadership at the Council on Criminal Justice? Given 2023 is the 50th year of mass incarceration, what should this panel consider this afternoon, and along with those in the audience, to meaningfully address the scale of mass incarceration?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. How much time do we have to answer that question?
So each of you will have about 7 minutes, and I'll give you a little hint when you're about a minute out.
Yeah. No, I mean, we could literally teach an entire semester on that question in and of itself. So I'll try to do justice in the short time that I have. But obviously, I want to reiterate the thanks to the conference organizers, especially Monica, who has pulled us all together and has worked really hard to get us all here. And thanks to NACDL for setting the stage to discuss what it is that we're here to talk about, which is the trajectory of criminal justice reform as we know it. I'm obviously happy and honored to be here to draw from my experience and insights from my involvement in the Council on Criminal Justice. We're only going to skim the surface of the complexities surrounding mass incarceration, and obviously want to pay attention to this kind of stark occasion that we're in, which is the 50th year since its onset, as you said, Nicole. Over the last 5 decades, we have witnessed an extraordinary surge in the US prison population, with over 5 million individuals under supervision of the criminal justice system, or the criminal legal system, as I've heard some people refer to it. and nearly 2 million people, disproportionately Black and Brown people, currently incarcerated. This obviously represents a 500% increase since 1973 and signals to deep-rooted issues that we obviously must address if we're going to curb the issue of mass incarceration. As we all begin to navigate this kind of critical moment that we're in, all of us, including the folks on this panel, as well as folks in the virtual audience, must approach the issue from a multifaceted perspective. 2 key points that I want to mention among many to consider as we strive for some form of meaningful change as it relates to mass incarceration. Obviously, mass incarceration did not kind of materialize overnight. It is a result of deeply entrenched systemic issues, including racism, as well as failed policies, racial and gender bias, as well as social perceptions of crime and punishment. Policies from the 1990s, such as 3 strikes and truth in sentencing, for example, contributed to the significant rise in incarceration rates while simultaneously doing very little to deter major crime. Any approach to mass incarceration must obviously be comprehensive, addressing these systemic factors, as well as failed policies, 2 of which I've just mentioned. The second is racial disparities. Racial disparities have been a consistent hallmark of mass incarceration. Study upon study upon study, including ones conducted by the Council on Criminal Justice, have consistently showed that Black and Brown people, but Black people in particular, continue to be more likely to be arrested, charged, and sentenced to longer terms for similar offenses compared to their white counterparts, highlighting the deeply ingrained racial bias within the criminal justice system. Acknowledging and confronting these disparities is not only a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity. Our solutions must explicitly counteract racial biases in policing, in sentencing, and literally in all stages of the criminal justice system. And so with these 2 points, again, among many others, as a constellation of our North Stars, we should also consider the following as points in a roadmap to further curb mass incarceration. The first one is evidence-based reforms. To meaningfully address the scale and the sheer scope of mass incarceration, we must prioritize evidence-based reforms. These include embracing programs such as alternatives to incarceration, including diversion programs, drug treatment courts, community-based initiatives that have shown to reduce recidivism, improve outcomes for people, particularly for addressing underlying issues such as addiction and mental health, unemployment, etc. Second is collaborative approaches. No single entity, or organization, or political party can dismantle mass incarceration alone. We absolutely did not get here because of partisanship, and we will absolutely not get out of it because of partisanship. Collaboration will be essential. Everything from community advocates to law enforcement, policymakers to legal experts, public defenders, prosecutors, and of course, directly impacted people. Engaging in diverse perspectives will lead to more holistic and effective solutions. We've also seen some really good results as it relates to this from the Cure Violence model, for example. The third one is smart sentencing. Rethinking sentencing practices is paramount. Lengthy sentences for nonviolent offenses often do more harm than good, perpetuating cycles of incarceration, depriving individuals of the chance to achieve true rehabilitation and healing, and successfully reenter into society. The adoption of second look, for example, mechanisms, which I know NACDL and a bunch of others on this call have been in support of, will allow for a reevaluation of lengthy sentences for individuals who, from the system's perspective, demonstrate rehabilitation and therefore pose minimal risk to society and therefore eligible for release. The next one is preventing recidivism. Obviously, breaking the cycle of recidivism is critical and crucial. Investing in education and job training, mental health services, substance abuse training for incarcerated individuals can help them successfully transition back into their communities, reducing the likelihood of them recycling back into the system. Ban the box, which I know has kind of up and down results, is a good concept. However, it needs to be expanded into the housing sectors as well, among many others. The recent expansion of Medicaid eligibility for incarcerated and detained individuals under the what is called 1115 Medicaid waivers will be undoubtedly a seismic shift into the reentry landscape. The last one I want to mention is the public perception and education. Shifting the public perception of incarceration and its purpose is absolutely essential. Addressing the misrepresenting narrative around crime, particularly violent crime, is, again, absolutely paramount. Advocates, particularly those who have been most vocal in supporting pretrial reforms, need to be more present and consistent with the combat, within the combat of imaginary and false roles these policies actually, based on the data, lend to crime. Only through consistent education and a heightened awareness by the average Joe and Jane, for example, can foster a society that values rehabilitation over punishment and therefore reducing the demand for mass incarceration. Obviously, as we embark on this kind of pivotal and crucial journey towards systemic criminal justice reform, we have to remember that the path ahead will not be easy for any of us. It requires a level of selflessness, courage, persistence, unwavering commitment, especially in tough times such as the ones that we're in, and an eradication of the idea of partisanship. By considering the systemic nature of the problem, confronting racial disparities, embracing evidence-based reforms, fostering collaboration, rethinking sentencing practices, preventing recidivism, and reshaping, in some cases drastically reshaping, the public perception, we can collectively address the scale of mass incarceration and pave the way for a more just and equitable system and future. We can absolutely do this together, but we must absolutely do it together. So looking forward to the discussion. I hope I did justice with the 7 minutes that I had. Thank you all for your dedication to this cause, and I obviously look forward to the valuable insights and the conversation that we'll have based on today's discussion.
Thank you, Khalil. You absolutely did justice to the opening question, and really appreciate your thoughtful comments and the focus on collaboration and partnership within those comments, as well as some of the other substantive and structural recommendations that you offer. So we're going to hold on to that. So folks, if you did have questions following Khalil's comments, please do share them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them before this session wraps up. But now we're going to go to Premal. Premal, my question for you is, how do advocates on the front lines, public defenders, and those supporting defense teams, very important given many of the people here in the audience this afternoon, help move the nation in a different direction given the impact of mass incarceration and the targeting that our most marginalized residents and neighbors often experience from law enforcement and other punitive parts of the criminal legal system? What is needed to strengthen public and criminal defense infrastructure and capacity? And what calls to action can be directed to the defense community?
Thank you so much for that question, and for including me in this conversation. I'm grateful to NACDL, to Monica, to everybody who pulled this together, and to be here alongside all of you. And I agree with Khalil upfront about how we could teach a seminar, over the course of a semester or even longer about all of these topics. So I will also try to do justice. I think when we talk about mass incarceration, it's important to take a broad lens before we jump into public defense, which I could talk about also for a semester in itself. But take a broad lens to understanding, what it is, how we got here, and therefore how we get out of it. So when we talk about 50 years of mass incarceration, I think that what we're really honing in on is tracing the explosive rise in the incarceration of people, right? The prison population itself dramatically increased starting in the 70s and then through the Reagan years. And of course, we continue to outpace the rest of the world. And this all is wrapped up in the declaration of a war on drugs and tough on crime politics that flowed around that time. Decisions were made during that time period to increase the use of state punishment through incarceration, to exercise social control, and to address social problems. But as Khalil said, and I want to echo this because I think it's really important, it didn't just happen overnight. And it didn't happen because of one or two presidents, right? There's a long history of racial oppression, of capitalism-driven policy choices, and of using punishment to maintain power imbalances. So mass incarceration is deeper than this growth over the last 50 years in many ways. Some people talk about mass incarceration and they're talking specifically about the number of people in prison and reducing that number, shrinking that number. I think it's more than that too. It reflects this huge network of social and economic forces that have been in play for a long time and that will continue to be. And I say all of this because it's important when we consider how to get out of mass incarceration, how to take it apart, because we need to have this broad, holistic understanding of the forces at play so that we can transform those and simultaneously make interventions into the system as it functions now. We need to be making changes to shrink it, to take it apart, to reduce the immense human suffering that we're causing. We also need to make those changes in a way that doesn't lose sight of that bigger picture of what's going on, because otherwise, the system will just shift and move in new ways to keep doing what it's been doing. So all that said, public defenders, public defense is my heart. I spent much of my career as a public defender, as a criminal defense lawyer. I know many of the people in the audience span the range of different types of criminal defense lawyers. I think defenders can do very important work to extract people from our system of mass incarceration and to address some of the structures and power imbalances that undergird it. On a day-to-day level, defenders are doing the work of reducing human suffering, of reuniting families, of helping to restore basic self-determination to people's lives. This work can't be understated. We need defenders to dig in, to keep doing it, and to do it well. And I say this because, of course, there's the human suffering component and alleviating it, but also day-to-day public defender work is how police misconduct and abuse is uncovered, right? It's how prosecutor misconduct is uncovered and addressed. It's how people's stories are told. It's how the system learns that there are real people in its courtrooms. It's how system actors are educated about the reality of the harms being inflicted. It's how jurors get engaged and come to understand their role in intervening in the criminal legal system. And so it's that day-to-day work of public defense or of criminal defense generally, that does so much to intervene in a regular, systematic way in the harms of the system. And I don't want to lose sight of that as we talk about the kinds of systemic work that defenders can do, right? That is happening every day. And we need people to continue doing it, and we need people to come into the field to do it. There's also a lot of systemic work that defenders do now and can do more of. Defenders around the country are doing all kinds of creative and hard work to tackle these problems. One example is the growth of the participatory defense model, which originated with Silicon Valley Debug in California and started as a sort of, in San Jose. And now it's happening all over the country in, cities, counties, small towns. And it's a model where public defenders are engaged with, or criminal defense lawyers more broadly, are engaged with and learning from and supporting the communities around them. They are working with the families and loved ones and friends of people who are brought into the system and charged. And, they are working alongside them. People in the community can become part of the defense team in some way. And so this is really important, right? Because of those relationships that grow, and because it helps individual people every day, their stories are better told. There are people there to support them. But bigger picture, it starts to shift the balance of power in courtrooms and in the system more broadly. It builds the power of those communities to guide what happens in courtrooms. And that's really powerful. Another example I want to mention is that defenders are increasingly engaged in policy and legislative efforts, and that can be really powerful, right? Defenders have front row seats to how the system engages with people every day. They have deep expertise in how the system operates. So putting that expertise to use in shifting policy can be really, really meaningful. A recent example, although there are dozens around the country, is in Cook County, Illinois, where defenders recently worked on legislation related to first-time gun possession laws, or to laws that govern when people on probation can be tested for alcohol or drugs or shouldn't be, right? These are the kinds of things that the criminal defense lawyers see in and out every day, and can change policies around. So taking that expertise to a different institutional body, and doing work along those lines can be very powerful too. And I think these kinds of efforts showcase the kind of real systemic reform and change that also keep in mind the larger work of trying to simultaneously shrink the system itself. Seeing how the power of public defense can be wielded through the front row seat that public defenders have, but also keeping in mind that there are bigger forces at play, and we need to be mindful and strategic in how we're kind of tackling both things at once. I'm eager to learn from you all about other examples, and to learn from my co-panelists about their ideas as well. And thank you again for including me in this conversation.
And thank you, Premal. And I think your comments around bigger forces align well with Khalil's opening comments, but also the concrete examples you gave of ways to build out the criminal defense infrastructure in alignment with public defense support and also defense teams through participatory defense efforts and other concrete efforts is incredibly helpful, given like what is needed for the movement, what is needed in terms of what's next to challenge mass incarceration. And so with that, I'll turn to Cynthia, who as a leader at the National ACLU has a great perspective in terms of affiliates and structures throughout the country and nationally to help support efforts around criminal legal reform. So Cynthia, given the reach of the ACLU, what does the movement need to support national, state, and local groups to address policing and a range of other criminal legal reforms, including bail reform, clemency, and other priorities? What recommendations can you share with the panel and those in the audience to continue the work of fighting mass incarceration?
Well, thank you for that question, Nicole, and thank you for including me on this esteemed panel with Khalil and Premal. Thank you to NACDL and your illustrious president, Mike Heiskell, of whom I'm very proud. And thank you, Monica, for convening us on this important discussion. Some years ago, the ACLU embarked on a Smart Justice campaign. And that campaign created a blueprint for every state, and it looked at the drivers of mass incarceration. And I just want to step back a bit when we say 50 years. Premal, I really appreciate your expanding it. I would expand it back to the more than 400 years of enslavement, because as we now know, today's carceral system is just a continuation of chattel slavery in America. So it's 50 plus years as we go back. But in the current age, the ACLU looked at the drivers of incarceration of each state, and we designed a smart justice policy revision plan for each state. And that's the kind of work that the ACLU can do, right? Can look across the country, see what's going on, and prescribe so-called solutions. And we made a lot of progress. I'll mention those in a minute, but the gains were undone almost as soon as they were made by those who would oppose, progress. When they gained power, they undid these across the country. We saw opponents do two things. Opponents of progress do two things. One, gain control of legislatures, playing a long game, and then roll back hard-won protections and preservations of rights and liberties. And these rollbacks were part of their long-term strategy. So one of the suggestions, and Khalil, you're absolutely right, we have to work together, is that we need a new strategy for long-term sustained gains. And one such strategy is to get local. More and more, we're finding out that to move in behind groups that are already on the ground, doing the work, who know the landscape, honoring their work, honoring the pain that they've endured in the work, groups that have garnered broad support. We need to help amplify those voices. They're not voiceless. The voices just need to be amplified in an effort to increase and activate their base. When the community is involved, the community has power to make this sustained change by shifting the Overton window, that window where we see policies that are acceptable to the mainstream at any given time. We can move those together to the left as they have been moved to the right, as it were, to roll back the reforms. We know that a majority of us embrace democracy in this regard. We also know that a minority that does not embrace democracy will by any means necessary subvert democracy. But by working together, we can build a democracy that includes not just some, but all. You know, I have to mention what we call the pro-carceral propaganda, right? It's very strong. We have a lot of things working for us. We have a better message. We have better policy. We just need to have better strategy. And that better strategy, as Khalil mentioned, means working more in sync, working more on offense. We've been working on defense an awful lot over the past decades. And that's what, you know, it's what's led us to this 50-year mark in mass incarceration. The ACLU has the potential to play a major role in changing sort of the messaging and the narrative given our platform and our reach, especially working in coalition with others, as I mentioned earlier, to amplify important messages about what has been proven to be ideas and activities that actually keep us safe, not fear-mongering and more mass incarceration, but data-driven programs that keep us safe. But we know that until facts carry the same weight as feelings in the public sphere, we need a more cohesive approach to shifting the narrative by placing progressive reforms that prioritize people over punishment at the heart of enhancing public safety. National, state, and local organizations have to continue to come together to share both our resources, our connections, and the lift of highlighting and normalizing successes that have been established, because we know the so-called failures, and I'll tell you why I call them so-called failures in a minute, have been a consistent message. So by being proactive and pushing back on this fear-mongering narrative, we can shift the tide. And you know, I recognize that sometimes we're not able to change minds before we change hearts, right? And Khalil, you know, there's only one mind, I think. Khalil previewed the idea that we need better, more accurate, and diverse data across the board. We can't change a racist and oppressive system using information provided by a racist and oppressive system. We have to expand the demographic information we're capturing. We have to work with people who are directly impacted and communities that are directly impacted to set performance measures. And we have to normalize the shifting of data collection and the concept of effectiveness in the criminal legal system from one focus simply on reducing recidivism, and I use that in quotes, to individual, familial, and community health, reinvestment, reunification, etc. I mean, all of the arms of society meet at the criminal legal system. Health, education, finance, you name it, they meet at the criminal legal system. And so we have to be involved in all of those areas. On the front end, the data looks like an appropriation tag, you know, money to collect the data, and criminal justice advocates and organizations being more versed in fiscal advocacy. We have to go after appropriations. The time has come. You know, we see right now in the approach fight with defenders, Primo, a significant effort to cut funding for defenders while at the same time increasing funding for prosecutors. So we have to be fiscally become fiscal experts and do our advocacy work on that policy side. On the back end, there has to be a commitment from policymakers, and we have to hold them to it, that a push from the public and advocates for change based on this data. In short, we need transparency. Don't you want to know what goes on inside a prison? I mean, if they're sending people there for our safety, I want to know what's going on, right? I mentioned that we've seen successes. I wrote out a lot here, but I know I'm coming up to my time. I'll name a few. New Jersey actually achieved the goal of 50% decarceration. It was largely during COVID, I have to say, when people were released, but nevertheless, they achieved it. We've pushed back on mandatory minimums in West Virginia. Maryland fought off weakening the authority of police oversight boards. Nationally, we got Fairfax Financial, the largest predatory bail bond company, out of the bail bond business. And we did this by keeping in mind the goal of shrinking the criminal legal system. We have to challenge the problem as early as possible. We have to preserve and revive jury trials We have to get rid of the trial penalty, and we need to encourage jury service. And lastly, which is near and dear to my heart, we need to provide second chances. People aren't disposable, and we need to show that we believe that. If we're a nation of second chances, we've got to offer second chances. And we need to support people when they come home. I mentioned transparency in the prison system. We also need to know how people are being prepared to return home. And there needs to be resources for folks when they come home. NACDO some years ago did a report on collateral consequences of a conviction, and they're myriad and a veritable minefield for those returning. They're a scarlet letter C, and we need to remove those barriers to reentry and stop labeling them as recidivism and failures, but systemic failures. I'll stop there because I'm excited about this.
And your passion is needed. I mean, we are in a moment of crisis and have continued to be in one, given the scale of incarceration. So thank you to all of you for your opening comments in response to the questions I posed to you. So I do want to invite folks in the audience to share a question in the Q&A, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think all of your comments, I mean, we started with opening comments from the three panelists. Clearly, there are a lot of different aspects in terms of drivers of mass incarceration, what the infrastructure that's needed to help combat this crisis of mass incarceration that the country is marking its 50th year in, and then solutions. There's a range of solutions that our panelists have offered today, from Khalil's recommendations earlier to Premal, and then ending with Cynthia's closing comments just recently. So before we return to the Q&A function, I wanted to ask you all if you had any comments in reaction to your co-panelist opening remarks. If there was anything that you wanted to remark on or add additional context to.
I know I just finished speaking, but I do want to just, Premal, take up from where you talked about the defense function. I spent last week training lawyers in Trinidad. And you know, when you train lawyers in other countries, you realize the import of what we do in our country. First of all, we are constitutional lawyers, right? We were so needed that the founding people of this republic, right, said we're going to enshrine the need for this kind of lawyering in our founding documents. And I think that speaks volumes to the heft of the lift for the defense function. Also, the heft of the impact that can be made from the defense function. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Thank you. Any comments from you, Premal or Khalil, reactions or other context you want to offer?
I just wanted to sort of echo and support comments by both Cynthia and Khalil about the importance of understanding that this is all going to be multifaceted, right? In both of your comments, there are sort of so many different policy initiatives and so many different approaches and so many different system actors. And, you know, I talked about kind of this high level understanding of like there's a broad lens of thinking about there's big forces at play here. They are historical, they are deep. We need to be thinking about those all the time and not lose sight of them. But the sort of the need for incredibly diverse and incredibly multifaceted interventions, small, medium, large, right, across the board by defenders, prosecutors, by everybody, is going to be really important. And I think it's a question of like how those happen, right, and how thoughtful they are and how much they're coordinated and that sort of thing. But there's that sort of multifaceted piece is one I just wanted to lift up too.
Yeah, and I'll just add to Premal and Cynthia's comments is just how critically important data is, and not only access to data, but having it in a timely and palatable manner. How critical that's going to be. I mean, not only for reforms, I mean, just in simply understanding the way that the system operates, particularly on a local level. You know, when we're engaging with these systems and we talk about data sharing, access to data, it's a language that they're all too often not fluent in, or even if they understand the importance of it, they don't literally have sometimes the infrastructure to actually provide timely and, again, palatable data. I think that's going to be critical in any of the advocacy efforts that are put forth, particularly on a local level, because we have to not only advocate for reforms, but we have to advocate in conjunction with timely reforms, the access to critical, important, timely, and again, palatable data, because we can't adequately judge how effective these reforms are because, I mean, surprise, surprise, maybe, sarcastically, maybe not to many on this call, but some of the reforms that we advocate for aren't actually that effective. Let's just be real. And we push and we use a ton of our allies, particularly our elected officials. We use a ton of their political, not only resources, but political capital to actually pass reforms that in the end come to find out that they're not actually that effective as we would have hoped. So that's something that I think is critical, and I think Cynthia has mentioned it, and I know it's important to all of the folks, particularly advocates on this conference, which is, in conjunction again with our efforts to pass reforms, we have to also be mindful of putting in the language and being specific about our asks around access to timely and palatable data.
As a staff person at a research and advocacy organization, sharing data and making it accessible, not just for practitioners, but also for people in the community. So folks in the church basement to the courtroom can make use of it in their comments and in the work that they're doing is needed to help combat this effort, to help combat mass incarceration. So there are some comments that have already started populating the Q&A function of the webinar. I want to invite others to add their questions to the Q&A function as well. I know that some comments populated the chat, but we're going to be looking at the Q&A in the webinar function. So let's first go to our friend Ron Simpson Bay, who's a leader at Just Leadership USA, a wonderful organization that's led by directly impacted folks, doing great work nationally and within states. Ron asked this question, I think given some of the comments that have been made by our panelists already, people generally don't care about what goes on inside of prisons. So how can we increase and improve transparency? Anyone want to take that first?
So I remember speaking with a criminologist from France who said, I asked him the question, what's the similarities between our systems and what are the differences? The similarities were, among them were that there are mostly Africans, right, incarcerated. But the difference is that he said, the only time we know what's going on in your system is when a lawyer files some pleading or when a journalist exposes something. And I think we need those two tools of the system to help with transparency. But I also think we need to gain the support of unlikely allies, like, just hold on, bear with me, like corrections officials. I mean, if prisons are dangerous, they are dangerous for people who are working there as well. And it seems to me that they can make good allies in shedding some light on what's going on and helping us to get legislators to encourage and require that we have transparency about what goes on in our systems.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that that I think people care more and more than we're willing to give justice to about what actually happens in prisons and jails in particular. And one of the ways that I use to justify that statement is because of the advent of, all of these reality shows around what happens in prisons and jails, and you see all of the kind of hype that people have around watching these shows and seeing how in real time someone's experience in jail or prison actually unfolds. I think that what we need to focus on is the narrative in which is being peddled by some of these TV shows and reality shows. Last night I was on a call with a longtime colleague and a friend named Vidal Guzman, who had recently launched a program called America on Trial. And essentially what the purpose of his program is to combat and attack the narrative that comes out of these reality shows, which is to really say that what we're talking about are human beings, and what we're talking about human beings in a moment of trauma, in a moment of vulnerability, and in a moment of helplessness, actually experiencing the real life road of detention and incarceration. And if we're going to exploit that for individuals, we should also be combating the narrative that all individuals who go through that process somehow are deserving of that and somehow are less than human because they are going through that experience. So I think that's what's important, is that we should be focusing on how do we combat the narrative that exists about people who are incarcerated and detained. We've also seen a huge explosion of footage, honestly, coming out of jails and prisons. If you think of any of the most recently exposed conditions that are being exposed to people who are in prisons, particularly in the Deep South, and jails all across the country, it's coming largely from cell phone footage that are being shot by individuals themselves who are technically on the ground as these incidences are unfolding. Now, separate and apart from the conversation about what do we do about contraband in the systems, the reality is that if it were not for these access to cell phones, we would not actually know some of the atrocities that exist in some of the jails and prisons across the country. So I'm not necessarily saying that we need more cell phones in prisons, but we do need more transparency. We all know for a fact that there is not any other largely publicly funded entity that exists in which we don't know a lot about what actually happens in jails and prisons. We don't, we cannot say the same about public schools. We can absolutely not say the same about hospitals. And there are a number of other examples. But time and time again, we're getting caught up in this narrative about, who cares and who doesn't, when the reality is that people actually do care, but their narrative is being shaped largely one-sided by the opposition, who are largely for incarceration without the access to true rehabilitation and services needed for someone to successfully re-enter.
Prema, go ahead, Prema.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sort of one kind of small comment and, echo, I guess, both Khalil and Cynthia on a point. Cynthia mentioned journalism, and I think that that's like, always a source of transparency, right? And can be strengthened in that regard too. But just following on what Khalil was saying about sort of transparency that we're getting through cell phones and more footage and that sort of thing, I think there is a growing sort of field of journalists and writers that are currently incarcerated. And I think that is, a tremendous opportunity and field to really focus on as a source of increased transparency, but also a source of expertise, right? And of recommendations and of knowledge about where we should be going from here, because they know what's happening right now. And so I just wanted to kind of boost the idea of supporting currently incarcerated writers and journalists to be able to speak more and write more without censorship and freely.
So those are real examples of creating transparency given the limitations that currently function to close off prisons and jails. Great point, Pramila, in terms of currently incarcerated folks who can share their experiences through public writing in national publications. I know the Sentencing Project has partnered with incarcerated activists in amplifying their voices. And I love the point you made, Cynthia. These, they're not voiceless. They have voices, they're just unheard. So amplifying voices of the unheard or the dismissed. And your points, Khalil, about cell phones, yes, I think, yes, they should be. There should be more. I think one of the paradoxes of that is the risk that incarcerated residents experience if they are found in possession of a cell phone. So there are states that have criminalized that possession, adding years, potentially decades to people's underlying sentences, contributing, reinforcing, exacerbating mass incarceration because of the additional charges that people can pick up once inside if they violate policies like possessing a cell phone. And yet, because of the use of cell phone footage, as you've shared, Khalil, the public has been made aware of atrocities that have happened inside, and that has led to some change. So maybe a solution to that is, given the resistance of correctional officials, no doubt, to the possession of cell phones by folks inside, as perhaps a safety valve or some post-sentence or post conviction review that allows people relief from an additional mandatory or additional sentence that because of the criminalized act of possessing a cell phone while inside of prison or jail. So those are some responses to some of the comments, and hopefully those are some specific examples of ways to address transparency given Ron's question earlier. So there are other questions that have helped to populate the Q&A function in the webinar. We want to encourage others to share as well. The next one up is Lisa. I'm hoping I'm saying your name correctly. And Lisa points to a contributing factor of mass incarceration as being post-release supervision fees. So this can help be a driver of people who are under supervision, either on felony probation or parole. And some states, people can be on parole for the rest of their life once released from a life without parole sentence. And if there are fines and fees obligations that they're required to complete, then that is a tax on them and can really impact that self-determination, their agency. Those fines and fees can undermine people's participation as full residents in their community in states like Florida and Tennessee, where fines and fees can continue to disenfranchise people, not just because of their supervision, but also literally from the ballot box. So there's a range of outcomes related to the fines and fees. So do any of you have reactions to Lisa's comment that is a driver of mass incarceration? And, what are efforts that you all are seeing around the country to address this practice?
I mean, I would say ditto. I absolutely agreed. The issue of fines and fees as it relates to involvement in the criminal justice system, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, are almost largely untalked about. Part of the interaction with the criminal justice system. I would say largely because of Meek Mill's involvement in the criminal justice system and the entire movement to just raise awareness of how one person who by societal factors should be far removed from the criminal justice system was actually continuously ensnared in the criminal justice system. And so, there's obviously been a level of awareness that has risen because of that. We have seen some states now become more laxed with the enforcement of fines and fees, or at least have more flexibility in terms of how they collect those fines and fees for individuals involved in the criminal justice system. But look, let's just be real. Like, there are people who get caught up in the criminal justice system all the time, who get imposed fines and fees that in some cases are more punishment than the actual time that they face or may not face because of that involvement in the first place. We've seen that time and time again happen in major cities across the country. We've seen it happen in states that have actually tried, to their credit, to attack the issue of fines and fees. Look, we cannot depend on people who are going through a system who may or may not have committed a crime, and in some cases that quote unquote crime is a crime of poverty or a crime of circumstance, and then impose harsh and unrealistic fines and fees on them with the expectation that it could take them decades to pay off, when their interaction with the criminal justice system may let them off with a probation or a couple of years in jails and prison. Again, not to say that there is any less punishment in serving any amount of time, but what I'm saying is that, that the issue of fines and fees is one that has obviously risen over the last 5 or 6 years, but we're far from where we need to be in terms of creating a system that is equitable and fair as it relates to the assignment of fines and fees because of a person's involvement in the criminal justice system.
In our clemency work, one of our asks for a category of clemency is for people with technical violations. We ask that they be given clemency and that they not be incarcerated based on the violations moving forward. Generally, those technical violations have to do with fines and fees. We're also working in coalition to reduce the fines and fees that are administered in a couple of ways. The problem is that these small jurisdictions rely on fines and fees as part of their budget. And so there's an act that's been introduced this Congress, Driving for Opportunity, where fines and fees are associated with driving infractions, where if a state opts in, then what they might have collected from the person can be given as a grant through the Department of Justice, so that that person doesn't have to pay that fine or fee in order to get their driver's license back, which, as you know, can be a great impediment. We also worked with one governor to not just grant clemency, but to give remission of a little over $1.4 million in fines and fees for the people to whom she gave clemency. And so we can see advocacy in that back end area. Clemency is not just reducing the sentence, but it's also stamping the ticket paid in full.
Premal, did you have anything to weigh in on there with? If you could even sort of broaden out fines and fees to also include bail, and how, and sort of the economic impact of people touched by or targeted by the criminal legal system, and how they can't get from underneath it. So at the front end with bail, and then at the back end with the fines and fees obligation that can follow some people in some states for the rest of their life.
Yeah. And again, I'm echoing parts of what both Cynthia and Khalil have said, but there's like the piece that is the audacity of charging fines and fees to people to experience the system that is punishing them, right? That is like fundamentally illogical, right, in many ways. And so then for me, the question becomes then, like, why is that happening? And if systems and as Cynthia was saying, is small towns in particular and counties are relying on these kinds of fines and fees to be able to run the system, then we need to be thinking about legislative shifts that will change that structure, right? That's just not an appropriate structure. And so there's this sort of policy and legislative work that I think that we should be really focused on, and thinking about the underlying structural reasons we are in this place to begin with. And then, as Khalil was saying, separately, there's an invisibility to pretrial release and to probation and parole. When we talk about mass incarceration, it gets lost a lot that people are suffering and are being punished while they're home or in their communities, and are constantly at risk of being reincarcerated or punished further. And so there's also a sort of public education piece that's really important. And I think I agree, Meek Mill did a lot to bring attention to this, and I think we need more public education about the fact that there are people in our communities that are being punished in this way, and it's not so visible or so tangible to the rest of us. And so that's part of it too. And as you said, Nicole, there's the thread that weaves through all of this is that the people that are implicated in the system to begin with, the people that we're charging and arresting and charging and putting through the criminal legal system, are disproportionately poor, are disproportionately Black and brown, and so these problems that are structural fall to them every time. And it makes it even more illogical that fines and fees would be part of what we're doing when that's true, right? Like when disproportionately poor people are being targeted to begin with. And so all of these things thread together and they weave together. And I think it's really important to, like I've said before, to intervene in these different ways, public education, legislative shifts, but to do so in a way that sort of zooms out too and understands what we're really doing here doesn't make any sense.
5 minutes left before we have to wrap up, and I have to turn it back over to Monica. There is one question that there's two people who've asked a question that I think overlaps, targeted to you, Khalil, but I know that Premal and Cynthia can also weigh in. And I think it's really about collaboration that is possible, and that all of your comments have spoken to today, given the scale of what needs to happen to meaningfully address mass incarceration and address the harms done to individuals and communities because of the punitive system that we're operating under in the United States. So, and I think in response to these questions, if there are specific examples of successes around advocacy collaboration that have proven to be effective, and also effective collaboration, particularly across the aisle, that you all can share in response to questions from Chris and David in the Q&A function of the chat. So Khalil, they pose this to you, but I have a feeling that Premal and Cynthia can also weigh in as well. So, but we'll start with you, Khalil.
Sure, and I saw one of the questions in there and was talking about, what are some reforms that we've worked on that doesn't seem to be the most effective. I mean, one of them is ban the box. I mean, there's data coming out showing that ban the box is actually not as effective as we all would have hoped when we first kind of pushed that notion of not for the employment purposes, just wholeheartedly just crossing a person out for eligibility for a position simply because they have had involvement in the criminal justice system, specifically have had a felony conviction because of that involvement. So I would say that's just one of a number of reforms that we've pushed that we're now kind of seeing that the data is showing that it's maybe not as effective as we would have hoped. In terms of examples of how we've worked on a bipartisan nature to pass criminal justice reform, and I should just say that the term bipartisan I also think is getting watered down in this field. I've worked in a number of spaces where if you just get one person from the quote unquote right, then it's all of a sudden bipartisan. Listen, I love David Safavian. I love him. Like, I have a tremendous amount of respect for David. But a lot of people, and maybe even some people on this call, they get David on a panel, or they get him or they get him on a task force, and they get him on a commission, and all of a sudden it's bipartisan. That's absolutely not the true meaning of bipartisan. One of the examples I can give is the First Step Act. Again, I know some people on this call may feel a certain way about the First Step Act, and honestly, if we're going to be honest, it's because of the people who were pushing the First Step Act, whether it be Van Jones or Jessica Jackson or Glenn Martin or Louis Reed. People had issues with the First Step Act. And granted, it was not a perfect bill. But once again, you show me a perfect criminal justice reform bill, and I'll show you absolutely a unicorn. There is absolutely no perfect legislation that's going to get us out of this, and it's not a silver bullet. It is absolutely a death by 1,000 cuts. And so the First Step Act was truly, I would say, within our most recent history, one of the biggest pieces of federal legislation. I say that with all due respect to everyone on the phone. That really took a lot of effort. I mean, we're talking about people who swallowed a lot of pride and ego to go into an administration that, for a number of reasons, was very skeptical to even pass criminal justice reform, to stand next to some people that maybe some folks did not really appreciate or even stomach them as individuals, but knew that if I say that I'm here to represent the incarcerated population, I'm willing to take all of the stuff that's going to come with this to actually help to pass this bill. So I would point at the First Step Act. I would also point at oh my God, I don't even know what, the Equal Act as another form of kind of push bipartisan efforts to try to get that disparity down to a 1-to-1. But if we're talking about what the data is showing us to be one of the most successful reforms, particularly on a federal level, I would say the First Step Act.
Yeah, I'll just lift up a couple of other things where marijuana has been legalized or decriminalized in states has largely been bipartisan. The ACLU issued a report that showed that Black folks and other folks smoke marijuana, use marijuana at the same rates, where Blacks are arrested and convicted at higher rates. And so this effort across the nation to legalize and decriminalize marijuana, I think, has been successful and broad spread, and it's spreading across. And I'll name that for us in Mississippi, of all places. We worked in coalition to defeat some mandatory minimum bills, some increases in probation and parole penalties. And I think it's a function of mass incarceration indeed being mass. It's touched so many people that we've begun to come back around to collect a number of allies.
I agree with all of these reflections, and I think we could spend, again, a semester talking about efforts that have either not been effective enough or that have been very successful. Going back to your sort of question earlier, Nicole, I just, on bail reform, one thing I would just say is, like, as we reflect on these things, which I think is really important, it's important to think about what we're talking about when we mean effective or success too, right? Like, so a thing I would just say is, like, let's all be cautious as we move forward with reforms too, and thinking about what the unintended consequences might be that we didn't envision of reforms. And I mentioned bail in particular because some of the things that can flow from bail reforms are, increases in electronic monitoring, which then, increase punishment more broadly, or increases in pretrial detention that are not related to money, but there's still lots more people detained. And so, not that, many bail reforms have been very successful at greatly reducing the numbers of people in jail. And I think that's, tremendous. I just think that we should be thoughtful about what we're thinking about when we think about success and effectiveness, and make sure that it's sort of like really shrinking the system as we hope it will.
Thank you. And I think the reality is to move the country back to mass incarceration levels, which were still too high compared to other Western democracies. It will take significant reforms, muscular reforms. So even in spite of your comments, Khalil, death by 1,000 cuts in terms of the incremental policy changes that can be gained with bipartisan coalitions or nonpartisan coalitions, frankly, it still has to meet the spirit in many ways of the types of changes that happened in the 70s and 80s that got us here in 2023. As we are moving into the last half of the year, we're in that last half of the year marking this 50th year of mass incarceration. The reforms that pass are nowhere near as muscular as the mandatory minimums in truth in sentencing and the abolition of parole policies that got adopted in a number of states over the last 50 years, driving up incarceration and imprisonment rates. So I'll get off my soapbox there because we're at time. And I just think where we are as people move on into the other content and other conversations that NACDL is hosting today and tomorrow, that there are other comments and questions that we can engage in together. And so sorry we didn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A, but this is not the end, this is the beginning. And obviously we are in a long conversation, a long-term conversation to challenge and address mass incarceration. So with that, Monica, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you to Cynthia and Khalil and Premal for joining this first conversation. And to sort of echo Nicole's sentiments, I think this is definitely a jump off, a beginning point to a lot of issues that have come up during this conversation. You'll see from the agenda, we're going to be talking and diving into issues around pretextual policing. We're going to have a conversation around bail and pretrial reform and really sort of how to continue to meaningfully advance these reforms while knowing that we're also simultaneously dealing with a lot of misinformation around pretrial and bail. We're going to have a deep dive conversation into sort of messaging and narrative and comms work, as well as sort of in the day two of this conference. So I really want to appreciate our panelists for sort of highlighting and again, sort of setting the stage for the rest of the two-day conference and sort of highlighting what's something that Cynthia said when she encouraged us to engage in budget advocacy. And of course, being from NACDL, I have to say, in terms of how we're sort of funding criminal legal system, particularly around sort of public defense and public defenders, that sort of disproportionality. And so I would encourage you to echo her. She mentioned something that's occurring at the federal level, but be mindful of what's happening in your state or your public defenders or your public defense system, because we include in that attorneys who take court-appointed cases. How are they being funded? Are they adequately being funded? Do they get the same sort of resources and support as their sort of prosecution function? So being mindful of that, there's issues across the country. I won't get into sort of my other department work and issues, but in terms of individuals sitting in jail without attorneys for weeks, days, months, even extending past a year. And so these sort of atrocities make sure that our sort of public defense systems, we want to shrink the criminal legal system overall, but while we have all of these people, we need to make sure that they are represented, and we need to do that by having those who are been tasked to defend them. So with that, again, thank you to our panelists. So our next session is going to start at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. You can go back to your email to the conference webpage and access that link if you're going to be joining us for the next session. Again, I want to sort of thank our panelists and for those who will be continuing with us. I will see you at 2:30.